Good morning, everybody. This is John Haller doing a Israel update roundtable with my friends Dexter Van Zile from the Middle East Forum, Brian Schrauger, End Times TV, and Jim Fletcher. What are you now, Arkansas.com or Oklahoma.com or something like that?
Yeah, close enough.
One of the guys who still admits to being a big Oklahoma football fan. So we're going to talk today about Israel, Zionism, and anti-Semitism, and try to make a little sense of the things that we see going on in the news. I'm going to start with Dexter. Most of us, I think, the connection that kind of brought us all together was the Christ at the Checkpoint conferences that were held starting. Brian, you might remember when they started. 2010. Okay. And so I started getting aware of it, I think through Brian's article about his, it might have been Dexter's article about Brian that I first heard of everybody. And then Dexter and I met physically at a Christ at the Checkpoint conference in Oklahoma, I think, goodness, about 2018.
Yeah.
So Dexter, I want to start with you and just to kind of get your general view of the lay of the land now, and just tell us a little bit about you and how you've come to focus on this issue in your work and professional life.
Well, it's a long story, and Jim and Brian have heard it, and I'm sorry to subject, and they were there during most of it, but so I'm sorry to subject them to this again, but I wrote an article critical of the church that I grew up in, the United Church of Christ, saying, why don't we say anything about the violence against Christians and animists in Sudan? And somebody in the Jewish community, Charles Jacobs, called me up and said, do you want to fight against BDS in liberal Protestant churches? And I said, absolutely. And I joke with people, and I tell people that I put my hand in the wood chipper when I did that. I was covering the commercial fishing industry. I was pretty good at it. I enjoyed it. But I realized that there was essentially like a civilizational onslaught against the Jewish people and Israel. And I spent basically 16, 17 years dealing with essentially the Palestinian Christian narrative that was used to turn churches in the United States and Europe against Israel. And the narrative was largely that essentially the Israelis were crucifying the Palestinian Christians. That was essentially the narrative, and also the Palestinian people in general. And as time passed, it became increasingly evident that there was another threat, that this threat wasn't just at Israel itself, but essentially it was against the Jewish diaspora in Europe, in the United States. And essentially that the same narrative used to demonize Israel was also being used to demonize Western democracies. And it became increasingly evident that there was this ideology called Islamism, which the Middle East Forum differentiates from the religion of Islam itself. And essentially what people were doing is that they were, essentially establishing a beachhead for this narrative or this ideology in Western democracies. And one of the interesting things is that it got a foothold in large part because the left in the West wouldn't stand up to Islamism, largely because they didn't think that Western democracies were legitimate. And they thought that the West was essentially the, settler colonialist countries, just like Israel, which is in unfair. And because they were founded in blood, that essentially that they were illegitimate countries. And that was the way. And so that Islamism really wasn't a threat, or even if it was, it didn't matter, because the countries that people were trying to defend were illegitimate themselves, just as Israel was. And it became, and around this is the interesting thing is that it became increasingly evident to me while I was defending Israel from its, dishonest detractors, that the same techniques used to delegitimize Israel were being deployed against the United States as well. And, for example, from the river to the sea is, we see that, and we have all of these land acknowledgments at nonprofit institutions. I went to Shakespeare on the Common last summer, and there was a land acknowledgement that said, well, we stole the land from the Native Americans and we're real sorry about that. And the thing is that from the river to the sea, that legitimizes violence against Israelis, whether they be Arab, or Jew or Christian. That was what the October 7th massacre was all about. And it was motivated by that notion that that Jews didn't have a right to live in the land that they were living on. And the thing is that, and I'll close with this as my, opening salvo, is that the October 7th massacre was basically a demonstration that Hamas was a promoter of Muslim male supremacism. They wanted to restore Jews to a position of subservience and submission as they had lived prior to Israel's creation in 1948. And in many respects, and this is probably going to, this is going to be somewhat controversial. It sounds like it's coming out of left field. But I basically regard Hamas as the equivalent of white supremacists in the aftermath of the Civil War. I regard them as the equivalent of the KKK, in that they basically want to establish a system of dominance over a previously submissive and beleaguered population. And that they view this population as having gained its freedom as the source of their misery. I think, it's pretty well documented that, essentially, white Southerners demonized blacks in the aftermath of emancipation to kind of keep them down. And I see an awful lot of similarities between how the KKK operated and how Hamas operated, because what they've done is that they've essentially tried to terrorize Jews and Israelis. And the interesting thing is that they took photos and images of it. They did it. And this is really one of the things that shocked me is that when you read about lynchings in the Old South, they took pictures. They took pictures of them hanging black men from trees. And then they turned them into postcards. And they did that to basically terrorize the African American community in the United States. Well, in the 21st century, Hamas went into Israel from Gaza, videotaped themselves doing exactly the same type of violence against Israeli Jews, for the most part, and some Israeli Arabs. And they did that to terrorize everyone. And the American left basically started encampments portraying these terrible acts of violence as if it was some sort of liberationist movement, when in fact it's actually a supremacist movement. That's what we're dealing with. And the thing is that in the long term, in the short term, it invigorated Islamists here in the West. But in the long term, I think it's going to make an awful lot of people very suspicious of Islamism as an ideology, because they ultimately they're going to realize that they too are targets of that supremacist impulse as well.
That's pretty profound. I would just build on that a little bit with I think it's a recent book, The Art of Return, by Eitan Wilf, who she was a member of the Labor Party in the Israeli Knesset for a while. I think she finally, I don't know, maybe she just lost she got disillusioned with the Labor Party and is not in the Knesset. But she's made the point that the images that we see from October 7th are very similar to the images that were taken of the desecrated bodies of Jewish soldiers back in the War of Independence, and which were sold in shops in the old city of Jerusalem. So I think there's a huge connection. I'm going to go to Brian and then to Jim. Brian, let's talk a little bit about, we all got kind of connected, as I mentioned, through the Christ at the Checkpoint, and how that was coming into the evangelical church. And I know you have some experience there. And then, Jim, I'd like you, when Brian's done, to maybe comment a little bit on sort of the state of the evangelical church relative to Israel and Zionism and anti-Semitism. So, Brian?
Well, I can, how do you want me to start? Like how I got involved, I guess?
Well, I guess just let's sort of, I think a lot of people that follow my channel know your story because we've talked about it before.
Right.
but just sort of give us the orientation of the people at Christ at the Checkpoint. And then I intend to go from there to some of our friends on the right and where they're going with this today. So I'll let you explain that.
It's interesting because the orientation has presented itself pretty much from the beginning as being an evangelical movement. In fact, its orientation is very much mainstream liberal Christianity, liberalism. Munther Isaac, who now heads up Christ at the Checkpoint, is a graduate of Oxford. He is very much now involved. I don't know if he has leadership, but he's very much now involved with Zile, a liberation theology movement based in Jerusalem that Dexter can tell you more about than I can. My apologies.
It's okay.
I had a call come in. I'm sorry. And I've lost my screen. Just a second.
We're talking about Munther Isaac and Sabiel and Friends of
Right.
Sabiel, North America.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry about
Okay.
that. I muted my phone, but my computer is connected to WhatsApp, and I had a call come in via WhatsApp, and it rang on the computer too. Anyway, so back to Christ at the Checkpoint. Its orientation is actually very much liberal theology, liberal Protestant theology, and yet it has presented itself as evangelical. It targeted, from the beginning, it was targeting young evangelicals, millennials, and now probably Gen Xers and younger people who are very keen about issues of social justice, and also who really don't have a strong biblical worldview. It has been declining among younger evangelicals, and they targeted them. They've not really targeted people our age. And it's actually been very effective. There are polls that have come out in the last few years indicating that a large number of younger evangelicals now are not supporters of Israel, as are or were their parents. So what the interesting trend, however, as to which you alluded to this, John, is that we're now seeing this movement reach into evangelicalism. It has presented itself as evangelical, even though it's not. But as evangelicalism in the West has become more like liberalism, old-time liberalism, and Jim Fletcher can talk to us about more of that, we're seeing evangelicals now move into this anti-Israel Christ at the Checkpoint narrative. It's interesting. I think it's worth pointing out, for those who are not aware, that basically Christ at the Checkpoint presents a narrative, an anti-Israel narrative, which is classic Palestinianism, the classic Palestinian narrative, but they put it in Christian terms. They've Christianized that narrative. And so you will hear the very same arguments coming from Christ at the Checkpoint people and their like, as you do from all the mainstream anti-Israel voices that are in the world today and are very, very loud. So that's the orientation. And it is, I'm sure we'll be talking about, it has now, this narrative has now reached into conservative political and religious circles. And it's, in evangelicals, it's not just those who have become kind of wishy-washy about biblical matters and their faith. It's also reached into those sectors of evangelicalism which have been prone or are prone to what is called replacement theology, which basically argues that the church replaced Israel, and all the promises of God to Israel are now, in fact, the sole property of the church. This theology goes back to at least the 3rd or 4th century, maybe even before, and it became the basis for what is called Christian anti-Semitism, which is a real blight on the history of Christianity. But I won't go into that now. We can talk about it more if you want to do so.
Sure.
So that's my take on the perspective, the orientation, as you said, of Christ at the checkpoint.
Okay. Jim, I know you've done a lot of work and talks about the current state of the evangelical church. If you could just kind of summarize that for us as we move forward.
Sure. I'll just be very brief about my own personal background because it has some relevance. I was raised in Southern Baptist circles in the Midwest and, kind of the late great planet Earth era. And so pro-Israel feeling was just in the air everywhere. And it's the opposite now. I come at this from, I spent many years in Christian book publishing. And so I actually met Brian in that arena. And about a little more than 20 years ago, the company I worked for was successful. And so we started an imprint of pro-Israel books to introduce to evangelical audiences. And so after about a year and a half, I was very frustrated with the slow pace of being able to promote these books within the evangelical book market, whether it was chain stores, ministries, what have you. We just couldn't give these things away. So one evening I was having dinner with the president of our sales rep company, and he knew the industry inside and out. And he said something that has stayed with me since. It was one of the most profound things anybody ever said to me. So I'm venting for 15 minutes about this problem, and he just listened. And finally he said, Jim, you have to understand something. The evangelical church today in America likes Israel. They don't like Jews. And that has stayed with me since. And so starting in about 2010, I really started studying this intensely and looking in the evangelical circles. I knew the main line and some Catholic traditions had been anti-Israel, although ironically in the Catholic Church after the Holocaust, there was real dialogue between Jews and Catholics was very good. And so now we have a situation where a liberal view of all this has crept into the church. And so in 2010, I really started researching and writing, and I like to do hands-on research. So I was doing that. I was attending conferences and things that were pushing a Palestinian narrative. And at the same time, the previous leadership in the evangelical church, and it doesn't matter what you think about these men, just for the sake of what we're talking about, so long as Jerry Falwell was there and Adrian Rogers and people like that, there was a pro-Israel emphasis within evangelicalism. As soon as those men died, passed from the scene, they were replaced by leaders that were at best indifferent to Israel. And in many cases, I discovered, much to my horror, that they were hostile to Israel. And so, they were clever about it. You can't just come out and trash Israel right off the bat. They spent years, in a way, it's ironic that they're follow the same strategy as some Muslim leaders. They don't care if they have to wait 100 years to accomplish their goal. They're patient. And so the same way these evangelical leaders have been patient. And I discovered a group called the Catalyst Conferences, and they would have 3 of these conferences a year in LA, Dallas, and Atlanta, which is interesting. They blanketed the country. Okay, LA is Rick Warren's territory. The Midwest was Bill Hybels' territory, and the East Coast is Andy Stanley's territory. And Andy Stanley in 1999 co-founded Catalyst. Well, I was really puzzled when I looked at the speaker lineup, and so I went to several of these, and I would listen to these talks by people like Lynn Hybels, who was giving an anti-Israel talk to straight up evangelical pastors and youth leaders. That's who Catalyst targeted. And, you know, she's standing there on the stage accusing Israel of war crimes, of, you know, rationing water and all these kind of things. And I was astonished by this. And then about in 2013, as Chuck Smith was passing from the scene in the Calvary Chapel circles, there was an effort to the Christian Palestinians, who are very smart, by the way. Their strategy is sound. Rather than, you know, continue to chip away at the main line and things like that, they went straight into the heart of evangelicalism, and an effort was made for about a year and a half to infiltrate Calvary Chapels, who is, you know, they don't call themselves a denomination and an association. It's the same thing. By far the most pro-Israel American denomination out there. And historically, it always been that. They still are, but there's been a bit of a split. But there was this effort to bring in speakers like May Cannon and Sami Awad into these evangelical settings. Chuck, in the last months of his life, he kind of slapped that down, and they resisted it. But you know, some of the damage was done. And so this is the way this kind of stuff has infiltrated evangelicalism. Russell Moore, who was lifelong Southern Baptist, he was president of the Ethics and Liberty Commission for a decade. You can track his writings about Israel from around 2008-9 to where they are now. And, you know, I can't tell you how he got there, but he is not a friend of Israel today. And now he is managing editor of Christianity Today magazine. So I know for a fact that Christian media largely is compromised on this issue. And 10 years ago, some of my friends with a large pro-Israel Christian group, they were saying if something isn't done, particularly among students on this subject, within 10 years, it's all over. Well, in my view, not nearly enough was done in 10 years, and here we are, and that date has passed. So this is where we are today. I think the problem is really serious. But I'll tell you, I'll admit, I have been limited in my ability to get this in front of people and make it matter to them. I think that, and it obviously has led to a rise in anti-Semitism. You've got people like Philip Yancey, the popular evangelical writer. This was back in the 90s. He wrote a column for Christianity Today. He referred to Jesus as a Palestinian rabbi. Well, we all know Jesus was never a Palestinian. But this kind of thought has really come into the mainstream with evangelical leadership. I don't think it's as strong in the pews, but that's only because the people don't know very much, to be perfectly honest. And the last thing I'll say about this right now is I think the reason the rank and file don't know much about it is the Bible is not really taught anymore in the American church, at least the American church model. And I'm talking about the church growth movement and stuff. Now, there are tens of thousands of biblical churches out there, there's no question. But the leadership and the church models that are used do not trend toward serious Bible study. And when you don't teach and preach the Bible in church, people do not understand the specialness of the Jewish people in history. And that's where we are today.
Thanks, Jim. I'll just note that within the last 24 hours, one person who I think is responsible for the decline in the teaching of the Bible and prophecy and proper biblical exegesis, a guy named Rick Warren, has just said, well, Jesus would not, this is typical of his, I wouldn't call it exegetical method, but the way he interprets scripture to suit his own views. He said yesterday that, well, Jesus would not take a position on any of the issues today because he died on the cross in the middle. He would be a centrist. And this is just appalling. I mean, Bill Koenig and I went to his Saturday night service a number of years ago, and I noticed he was making little tick marks on his bulletin as I was, and I said, "So what was the tally?" And he said, "Well," and we both had the same thing. He had 13 Bible references and 8 different Bible translations that he used in that message. So anyway, I want to move over here to this a subject that I think is something that's coming up, and this will, I think, give us some fodder for things to discuss. My friend Dumasani Washington, back in April or late March a year ago, Tucker Carlson, who is a darling of people on the right, and we might agree with 80, 90, 95% of things that he stands for, but he did a very interesting interview of Mother Isaac. And that led Dumasani Washington to write this article at Tablet magazine called The Arsonists, Tucker Carlson Whitewashed Murderers to Set Fire to Evangelical Jewish Relations. Having looked at that, watched that interview, and having interviewed Dumasani Washington, I would say that I don't think that Dumasani Washington understated the problem that we've seen. I'll just kind of throw it open. Maybe we start with Dexter. Dexter, what is, from someone who grew up in a home where Israel held a special place, the Jewish people held a special place, what I've seen is just madness of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, anti-Israel stuff growing. And I guess maybe I'll just ask you is what is going on? We'll start with you.
Well, we saw this prior to World War II. We saw, in the 1920s and 30s, we saw an enormous amount of hostility towards Jews. Not just in Germany or in Germany, but we also saw it, expressions of anti-Semitism here in the United States with folks like Father Coughlin and Lindbergh and that type of thing. And I think that part of it is there's an isolationist impulse that is afoot. And also, I think that ultimately that essentially civilization itself is kind of in flux. And so what happens is that when people who feel like things are unmoored or unhinged, they start to look around for a scapegoat to essentially direct their fear, anger, and rage at. And the thing is that historically, after the Holocaust, essentially that generated a fair amount of sympathy for the Jewish people and added to the legitimacy of Israel. But in the years since, and it started to kind of go first on the left, maybe in the after the 6 Day War, once Israel resoundingly defeated its enemies, essentially there was this narrative on the left that basically Israel was an illegitimate country that murdered the indigenous people of the world. And on the right, the narrative is that essentially that the Jewish people were an obstacle to the proper moral order. We see that with E. Michael Jones. We see that with other commentators that I have actually, they've kind of fallen off my radar because of my work at the Middle East Forum. But essentially, and that narrative had always essentially been there, but once people started to get anxious and unhappy about the state of the world, largely after the collapse of the post-World War II order, essentially they started to cast about for some sort of scapegoat to project their anger and hostility at. And one of the things that I have said, is that the Holocaust does not, arouse the same horror and outrage that it did during our childhoods. I was probably one of the last age cohorts that had either fathers, uncles, or grandparents who fought in World War II and understood the evils of Nazism. Okay. And they understood the evils of the Holocaust and just the complete destruction that it wreaked on the world. As the Holocaust is faded largely from memory, essentially that horror is gone away, and people think that you can foment hostility towards Jews without any sort of long-term consequence. And there was a time when if you spoke in the kind of the tones that these people have been speaking with and using the language that they have, that it would harm your career. But the thing is that at this point, it doesn't look like it, there's other things going on. There's an isolationist impulse. And the thing is that American support for Israel is generally regarded as kind of the only reason why we have anything to do with the Middle East. And I think that's really one of the what's going on is that isolationist impulse is basically causing people to cast it out and look for somebody to blame for American interventionism overseas. I've even gone so far as to tell people that I think that it's time for a moratorium on Holocaust memorial events because they don't work. They don't, because instead of actually arousing, the moral outrage towards anti-Semitism and legitimizing the Jewish state, what it does is that in some quarters it basically, they're talking about the Holocaust again. And I think that the way to respond to it is to actually talk more about, one, to provide people an alternative to engaging in anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism and hostility towards Jews is a field of action for people. Okay. And just the same way that white supremacism was a field of action for people and in the American South. And it took a lot of work, but eventually that people realized that white supremacism was just, if you engaged in it, you were going to discredit yourself. And I think another thing is that I think we need to start to speak openly and honestly about the problems that Islamism presents to the West and say, why are we actually siding with the Islamists against Israel and the Jewish people? Because whenever you look closely at this, wherever this ideology of Muslim male supremacism gets a foothold, whether it's in European cities, the safety of women in public goes down, and religious freedom and declines. Free speech goes into the tank, and also increased. And one of the other markers is increased hostility towards Jews and towards Israel. And it's like, why? And it's an anti-civilizationist impulse. Why are we paving the way for this by our own expressions of anti-Semitism? And rather than actually alert people to the horrors of the Holocaust, I think we need to look and force people to compare the success of the Jewish state with the retrograde suffering that exists elsewhere in the Middle East. And just one last thing is that one of the reasons why my work is, become so important to me is that I've had numerous conversations with people that have fled the Middle East and also South Asia as well. They've either fled Pakistan or Bangladesh or Egypt or Iran, from the Middle East. And they've all said, Dexter, we left these regions to get away from the threat of Islamism. We came to the United States, and now we see this Islamist threat coming here. Why don't you do anything about it? And one of the premier markers of that Islamist threat is hostility towards Jews. And sadly enough, people on the Christian right are starting to make alliances with Islamists particularly here in the United States. And they think, because they agree on a number of other social issues, and that legitimizes their enmity towards Israel and towards Jews. That's where we are.
Okay. So, Brian, Jim, weigh in.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I'm absorbing what Dexter had to say. Dexter, that was really profound. I think it's really helpful. why are we where we are? Is that what the basic question that was, John? Is John?
Yes.
I think it's important to acknowledge that anti-Semitism crept into Christianity very, very early on. Arguably, the Apostle Paul was dealing with it when he wrote Romans chapter 11. There had been an exile, all the Jews in Rome had been exiled, and he was writing to Christians in Rome and saying, don't be arrogant. God has not abandoned the Jews. And if I could, I would be cursed for their sake. And he says in that same letter to the Romans that the gospel is still to the Jew first. So he was very much combating what would become an attitude of superiority over Jews by Gentile Christians. These are the roots of what's called replacement theology, that Christianity replaced Judaism, that the church replaced Israel. And as such, my contention is that anti-Semitism entered into the DNA, it corrupted the DNA, if you will, of Christianity almost from the beginning. And so in every stream of Christianity, even in those where there have not been, at least in recent decades or years, anti-Jewish sentiment, anti-Semitic sentiment, it is now being stirred up, and it's being inflamed. What's being inflamed is an ideology that was put into, as I said earlier, the DNA of Christianity almost from the beginning. And so there is an inclination to, there's a draw to it, there's an insidious attraction to these arguments. And they go to the whole issue of the whole arguments of the Jews killed Jesus. You'll very much hear that today among Christians, and supporting evangelical Christians. I got to tell you, I remember one conversation I had in Bethlehem back in, I guess it was 2014, perhaps, somewhere in there, about 11 years ago, with a friend here who had been very wonderful to me. And I was speaking with her around the time that the Pope was coming to visit Bethlehem. And we had a conversation, and she said, I was talking to her about the anti-Semitic things that were being presented in Manger Square, and that the Pope was implicitly endorsing by not saying anything about them. And she said to me, well, but the Jews killed Jesus. And I said, Jesus is Jewish, but they killed him. And I said, he is Jewish. And it was so ingrained in her. Granted, she's Catholic, she's not evangelical, that she couldn't get past this. And we're seeing voices come up in social media that are fanning the flames of these very, very anti-Semitic Christian sensibilities. I know that's not the right word, but it's fanning these flames. And I would suggest that in addition to all of the, I think, very profound things that Dexter's pointing out, these flames are being ignited in and among evangelicals, because even in and among us, there is an inclination to be, perhaps, as Jim said, I think it's really profound what someone told Jim, that Christians, even evangelicals, tend to love Israel, but not Jews, something along those lines, right, Jim?
Yes.
So anyway, that's my additional input for whatever it's worth.
Jim.
First of all, I think both of these comments are spot on. I liked what Dexter said about civilization being in flux. I think that's part of this as well. For me, there are really good secular answers, but I tend to park on the religious side of it. And first of all, at the root, I think anti-Semitism is a spiritual sickness that is in a person, and it can be, it can be cured, so to speak, but it's difficult to do. And so I think what has happened, the reason why we're where we are, and that's always the most interesting question to me. I always want to know why things are the way they are. I don't want to start in 2025. You need to go back into history, into antiquity, as Brian said, and so you can make a strong case that as soon as the German higher critics infected the seminaries in that country, that's when the mythologizing of the Bible started in earnest, okay, since the Enlightenment. And it was interesting, as soon as the masses had access to a Bible, then, you saw these terrible worldviews that were added to this, and to try to attack the Bible. And so, and I know this is a different subject altogether and controversial, but I think it's linked. At the same time the German higher criticism took effect, Darwinian philosophy was being published and marketed to the West, okay? And it went across the Atlantic, and by the late 19th century, it was really weird that American clergy, it's like they had been waiting to embrace Darwinian philosophy. And I think, by the way, that's all it is. It's philosophy. It's philosophical. It's what you choose to believe about the Bible. And I unashamedly embrace the historicity of Scripture. I don't have any problem with any of it. And so, if people start stabbing at the historical accounts, Genesis 1 through 11, let's say, then what does that do to Genesis 12 through 50? If Genesis 1 through 11 is in some part or wholly mythological, what is the rest of the book? Genesis 12 through 50 is the beginnings of the Jewish people. It's the claim to their ancestral land. And if you can knock the props out of that in people's minds, you're going to end up where we are today. I have had hundreds, at least, conversations with teenagers, college students, and I'll tell you this, they will say to me, look, if Genesis 1 through 11 is myth, then why are you telling me that Jesus existed? Why are you telling me that the resurrection was real? They're smart. They make that logical conclusion. And so if that isn't true, then this isn't true. And that's largely why we're where we are. The American seminaries were infected with this kind of thought 125 years ago. Princeton fell by 1925, and all the great Presbyterian theologians there left and started Westminster Seminary because Princeton was gone theologically. They still are. Look at the anti-Semites in Ivy League seminaries today, and it's filtered down to the churches because the seminaries turned out clergy that did not believe in the historicity of the Bible. People don't believe me, but I've got the documentation here at my fingertips. Even Southern Baptist sources 80 years ago were giving some voice to professors that questioned whether the Exodus happened. You can't do that and tolerate it for decades and expect to find strong Israel support in America. It's not going to happen, and it didn't happen. And so I'm just saying that's why we are largely where we are today. It came from the spiritual side. talking about anti-Semitism in Europe first, the German Christian movement in the lead up to the Nazis, the German Christian movement ignored teaching the Hebrew scriptures. They ignored the Old Testament. Well, after a few decades of that, nobody in the rank and file knows anything about the specialness of the Jewish people. Their role in history, past history, present history, future history, it's not there. And I'm telling you, by and large, people in the pews in America today know nothing about Jewish history. They particularly don't know a thing about the Holocaust. I was raised in church and didn't know anything about it till I was in my 30s. The way I found out about the German Christian movement was in a book I bought at Yad Vashem in the 1990s. And that gave me my first education. And everything I've read since leaves me completely unsurprised that we're where we are right now.
Hey, Dexter, I want to talk a little bit more with you and the others about how this anti-Semitism has kind of morphed into affecting people on the right wing of politics. But before, as you lead into that, I want you to talk a little bit about, I saw the video of your encounter with what I could only describe as a mob in Boston a couple of years ago. I think it was a couple of years ago. Sort of a anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian mob. Just tell us what happened there, and then kind of go off into like, how is this coming into the right wing of American politics so quickly?
Yeah, the joke that I tell people is that I got mobbed by Students for Justice in Palestine before it was cool. And this mostly actually deals a lot with what's going on the left. But I think I can. What happened was in 2020, there was an anti-Israel rally, and it was basically people who were hoping to hop on the bandwagon of the Black Lives Matter movement and the Antifa uprising, and they wanted to connect the anti-Israel movement to the energy that those folks were able to generate. And there was one speaker there by the name of Nino Brown, who essentially said some terrible things. He spoke in language that you can't say on a good Christian show. And I wrote about it, and it turned out that he was actually a Boston public school teacher. And he said hateful things about Israel and the United States, and he also promoted black separatism. And it was very clear that it was radical leftist politics. Well, you can't even call it leftist. It was, like we're talking like authoritarian communist politics. And so I wrote a couple of articles about it, and it was in the middle of COVID. So then a year later, on 2021, June 24th, 2021, there was an event, similar event, and it was a repeat of essentially the rally that took place in 2020. And one thing I have to tell you about what happened in 2020 is that it was mostly basically young white kids. And there was a few Palestinians and a couple of African Americans, Nino Brown, and then also some people from the Native American community. There was one person who got up on the steps of the State House and basically had all of these kids, these white kids, basically scream. They did some sort of primal scream, something out of like, the 1970s EST or something. I don't know, but it was nuts. And the thing and he basically said, look, scream out your sin and your shame and your guilt. And then basically he said, okay, now go redeem your land. And he basically anointed them inhabitants of Turtle Island, which is essentially the mythological place where the Native Americans lived, where nobody ever did anything bad to each other. It was like a utopian state. So I wrote about that in 2020, documented it pretty well. Nino Brown was at another rally in 2021, and he was no longer working for the Boston Public Schools. Okay. And I don't know anything more about that other than the fact that he didn't work for him anymore. And so he said we're being spied on, because I was there with my notebook and my iPhone and a couple of other my friends from the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. And I went up to Nino and introduced myself, and I said, "Hey, it's me, Dexter Van Zile. I wanted to make it clear that we weren't being spied on." And then within about so then a few minutes later, we were in front of the ADL offices, and he basically they interrupted the thing to kind of single out my presence, and they started to essentially like kind of get ready to mob me. And I didn't back down. Towards the end, I got a little exhausted from it, but it was a frightening thing. And at a certain point, Nino Brown grabbed the microphone and led the group of about it was probably, I don't know, maybe 100 people total, but there was 30 or 40 protesters that surrounded me. One of the rally marshals tried to take my pen away from me and my notebook. I had already given my iPhone to somebody else because he didn't have enough storage on his iPhone to document events. That was providential. And they started screaming, "Zionists, go home, home." And so I chanted back, "Israel high," like 3 or 4 times. And that incited the crowd. It was astonishing. At that point, somebody threw water in my face, and that was when things went really south. And it was probably one of the worst 7 minutes of my life. And we got the video of it on YouTube. There was 2 people, to their credit, who basically 2 Latino people, I think, that said he's done nothing wrong, leave him alone. And there was one guy that was part of the crowd said they will use this against us. One Zionist is not worth it. And so it was pretty clear that there was essentially a notion that some people might have wanted to do me. We're going to do me physical harm. And there was also a member at the time. I didn't know it at the time, but it appears that he was a member of the Nation of Islam. He was a member of the Fruit of Islam. He was one of their rally marshals, and he screamed, or he didn't scream out. He said, "You messed up." He didn't use that word. He used another word. He said, "You insulted those people when you said the word Israel." And he said, "You got to get out of the way." And at first I said no. And then I turned my back to him, and he shoved me in the back. We got a call out on video. And then essentially the crowd moved on. And what it demonstrated is that essentially that the anti-Zionism and the anti-Israel hysteria had clearly, this was organized by Students for Justice in Palestine from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And we tried to alert and get the people from the UMass system to respond to it, but they didn't. I tried to press charges against them. I went to the police. At one point, they put an array of 6 African-American individuals in front of me, and I wasn't sure who it was. And I said, "I'm not going to identify any of these people because I can't be sure that it was him." And they said, "That's okay. We know who did it. He admitted to being in an altercation with you. He was working, and he was like a security guard for the crowd." And so I tried to press charges, but the magistrate, this was December of 2024, very early December, said, "I don't even see why we're here." And as it turned out, the person who shoved me was already facing charges for assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, because he was eventually convicted on those charges. I think for stabbing somebody. And so this was the person that Students for Justice in Palestine had hired, or not hired, but had enlisted or recruited somebody that was facing charges for stabbing somebody. And it was astonishing. And essentially nobody wanted to really hold any of these people accountable. And it was one of the most frustrating moments of my life. And it was a very unhappy thing. I think one of the things that we may have to consider in the possibilities is for folks on the American right, the events of the COVID-19 lockdown, the BLM protests and the Antifa protests, and what happened in American cities during all of that time, the violence, essentially it provoked in the hearts of an awful lot of average citizens tremendous rage and anger, okay, and unhappiness. And so, and the thing is that when you have that, and I'm just kind of spitballing here, I'm thinking about it right now. And when you are afflicted with that type of rage and anger, you're going to look for a scapegoat to project it onto. Okay. And the thing is that as Christians, we all have the ability to essentially hand that rage and anger over to Christ. That's basically what our calling is. That's what we're supposed to do. Okay. We're supposed to join our suffering with that of Jesus so that he can redeem it and give it back to us in a manner that doesn't require us to go around scapegoating the people in our lives. That's really what that's about. That's the whole Christian thing. You know, we give it up to Jesus. And, you know, I'm a Roman Catholic. You guys are evangelicals. But the thing is that I hear evangelicals say, you know, they caution me all the time, you got to give that up to Jesus. And so, yeah, you put up an article. And the thing is that like, here we, yeah. So that's where I think some of the rage is. The article that you just put up is about a trip that I went on in mid-December. And the thing is that you would think that I wouldn't get myself in jams like this again. You would think, Dexter, why don't you just like be careful from now on? And the thing is that so I went to England in mid-December. No, like from December 6th to the 20th. And I really didn't have an agenda. I was like, you know, I had some people I was supposed to talk to and meet with, but I knocked on the doors of mosques that had a history of promoting radicalism and Islamism. And the first one that I knocked on, I was like, I got to do something. I knocked on the door of a mosque in London, the Islamic Center of England. And I was going to wait till Monday, but I said, no, I got here on a Friday. I'm going to knock on it on Saturday. And I'm going to get at it. But I was like, it's not going to work. I'm not going to get anything. I go into the mosque. I ask if I can sit and watch their prayer service. And they said, sure. And so I set up a chair in the back right corner. And there you see, if the people at home can see it, was a picture of Ayatollah Khomeini on the back wall. And I was like, am I making this up? I was like, this cannot be real. And I shook the hands of the imam who had been in trouble with the interfaith type of people before. I don't want to get into too much detail because I don't have it right in front of me. But the thing is that I said, I just took the picture. I said, all right, if I take the picture, and I went straight over and videotaped it and took pictures of the Ayatollah right there. And this is a guy that has basically established a regime that has killed British citizens, killed British soldiers. Okay. And previously, I think they had a memorial at this mosque for Qasem Soleimani, who had basically been responsible for the IEDs that killed American and U.S. soldiers. We have a similar problem with mosques here in the United States. Okay. Then I went to another event. I tried to go to another mosque, but I went to a restaurant in Birmingham and started a conversation with people, telling them I wanted to write about interfaith relations in the United Kingdom since October 7th. And they said, well, what happened? And the conversation at first started very well. But then the conversation, they said, well, what happened on October 7th? And I said, well, you know, the Hamas went into Israel and raped and killed and murdered some people. And they got furious and they started screaming at me. And they said, and to my everlasting shame, they were so angry and frightened. They said, you said they raped. I said, no, I didn't. And I had, okay. And I was just frightened. Okay. And they started screaming at me. And eventually they told me to get out of their restaurant, but they wanted to deny everything that happened on October 7th. They portrayed the United States as the source of everything that was wrong in the world, and that they thought that the Jews controlled the United States. Then later that week, or that time, during my time, I went to a mosque in Manchester, walked in, said, come on in, told them the same thing. I was interested in doing an interview, talking to people about interfaith relations. Somebody was like, come on in, we want you to meet our uncle. And, you know, which was a name that people use to describe somebody that was there at the mosque founding, and he was somebody that was revered. And I talked to him. He was a loyal British citizen. He had moved from Somaliland back in the day. He loved John Kennedy. He loved the United Kingdom. He loved the United States. But everyone around him would like grimace when he expressed his love. And so then I sat through the prayer service, and you know, it was clear that the hostility towards Israel was off the charts. That they did not like the United Kingdom, and that they were unhappy being in a liberal democracy, you know, and they did not like their fellow citizens. And then the prayer service started, and they, I knew I was in trouble because the guy who was leading the prayer service was sitting in a chair that had a red Palestinian keffiyeh draped over the back of it. And I said to myself, you got to, at what point I was like, this is not going to go well. And then after the prayer service was over, somebody came up to me, the property manager, who was one of the leaders of the mosque, said, come with me. He basically had me follow him into an office and lock the door behind me and said, why are you here? And I told him why. And he says, but you weren't invited. And I said, oh, in fact, I was invited. And he asked me who invited me. And I told him the name of the individual. I had written it down in my notebook. He had said, come on in. I want you to meet some people. He said, but he had no authority. And I said, well, and at a certain point, I said, okay, if you want me to leave, I'll leave. And I grabbed the door and I couldn't open the door. And the thing is that this was a moment that had repeated us. This was something that had happened before with another journalist from the United Kingdom at another mosque. I think it was the Finsbury Park Mosque. He had basically been locked in a room with his interlocutors, so to speak. But eventually he let me out. And the thing is, when you go into a mosque, you have to take off your shoes. So my first job was to find my shoes. And he was following me, the person that was yelling at me, with his video camera, and said, do you have an agenda? And I had handed my business card and told everybody who I was from the very beginning. I told them my name was Dexter Van Zile and I worked for the Middle East Forum. But the thing is that I got out of there, put on my shoes, and there was somebody that was following me for a few steps. But so what I did was I waited. I'm sorry to tell this story, but it's funny. The first thing I did was I saw a woman that was a crossing guard with a police uniform, and I stood across the street from her and said, well, if they attack me, at least she's going to see it. And I called an Uber, and the thing was, and I want to make it clear, is that it took a long time for me to basically get beyond what had happened in June of 2021. It took a long time. A similar event happened just this past December, and I was able to shake it off with the love of Christ within a couple of minutes. I was laughing about it. It was one of the funniest things that I had ever seen. And when he said, do you have an agenda? And he was following me with his iPhone. I looked him dead in the eye. I said, my name's Dexter Van Zile, and I work for the Middle East Forum. And apparently that video was around on WhatsApp channels in Manchester afterwards. I haven't seen it on the internet, but what's going on? People are enraged, people are unhappy. And the thing is that our religious leaders have done a terrible job of basically addressing that rage and unhappiness. One last thing, everybody loves Dietrich Bonhoeffer, okay? I'm not a huge fan of him. Germany needed a Billy Graham. That's what Germany needed prior to World War II. In the 1920s and 30s, they needed somebody that could minister to the millions of young men who came back terribly damaged from the front of World War I, who had lost their limbs, who had had their spirit broken. Okay? And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was right. He basically pointed and said, you're going to be judged by Christ, and stupidity is a real problem here. But the thing is that there's a whole bunch of people out in American society who are broken. Okay? And this doesn't have anything to do with my work at the Middle East Forum, but we all know that there's a whole bunch of people out there that are broken. A lot of broken people out there, and they need somebody to minister to them. And the thing is that what has happened? They're basically being told that they're evil, that they are inheritors of an evil system of governance, that they are inheritors of a settler colonialist system that makes them unworthy of being loved, and basically portrays them as if they're the source of all the evil in the Western civilization, and that they are inheritors of a sin. And original sin's real, okay? And the thing is but at the same time, it's not the type of sin that they're projecting on is for sins that they didn't have any responsibility for. But the thing is that when you have religious leaders who are spending more time hurling lightning bolts of judgment from Mount Olympus at beleaguered and damaged people, and then wondering why they're not being listened to, and that they're going over to extremism, well, that's why. If we had a Billy Graham that would go out and say, we get it, we understand your suffering, and we are going to help you accomplish the goals, the developmental tasks that you face as a human being, as a young man especially, you'll be able to, get people away from this extremism. For most people, most of the time, the pursuit of happiness generally means getting married and raising a family. And the thing is that when the church goes into this politics, and take a look at the pastors, do you think that they're really capable of helping young men accomplishing those tasks? I haven't seen that. I don't see that. I see people who are very good at inciting anger and talking about some sort of cosmic justice. But as far as being able to help individuals address the challenge that they face in their lives, I'm not seeing it. And that's why anti-Semitism is so attractive to people, because it gives people a scapegoat onto which they can project their hostility. And the thing is that when you, and here I am, I'm speaking as a Christian, when you come to Christ with your demons, that exorcism is not a pleasant process to go through, okay? But it helps you become a fully functioning and fully formed adult. And the problem is that we don't have a lot of adults in the American clergy, from what I can see. And that's why they engage in this childish games of hostility towards Israel. And the thing is, and this is one of the things, if you want to look at a community that can do a better job of helping to raise young men to accomplish the developmental tasks of being a husband and a father, Muslim leaders in the United States, some of them are very good at that. And I don't think that Christian leaders are very good at it at all. I'm sorry to go off on that tangent, but that's what I see.
Interesting. Okay, so we're going to go probably another 20 minutes or so, and we could go for hours probably easily. And Dexter, I appreciate you tying up those ends. I too have my concerns with the elevation of Bonhoeffer. There are certain things that we like about him, but there are also some issues there that get swept under the rug. Let me shift right now to the current political landscape, since we haven't offended enough people yet. But the Middle East is a mess. What is going on with Gaza, the Trump administration, the allegations of genocide, ethnic cleansing, on and on and on. Let's just, Jim, why don't you start, and we'll just kind of go around the circle on this.
Specifically, about?
Well, let's just talk about what's going on with Gaza, the reaction to Trump's statements this week. I haven't checked the last 20 minutes, so I don't know what he's done recently.
Yeah.
But it's sort of like you don't want to be away from your news feed for 30 minutes with him. But there's the plan to move the Gazans out. And I will say, at the World Government Summit yesterday or today, the ambassador of the United Arab Emirates to the United States was asked about what Trump had said about moving the Gazans out and then rebuilding Gaza in some fashion. And his response was, there's no other viable alternative. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. First of all, I know people can think differently about this, but after 30 years of Oslo failing every day and really only causing more misery in the region, I think, I don't think that idea is bad at all. In fact, there's already videos of individual Palestinians who are risking their lives by doing selfies from Gaza saying, Trump, yes, I'm ready to go. Tell me where to go stand and what bus to get on. Yeah, I want to leave Gaza. They've been living in misery for decades. And so I don't think from a practical standpoint that that's a bad idea at all. The problem I see from Trump and his staff right now is what I call uneven messaging. First of all, unless I missed something on Monday, he made yet another line in the sand where he said by Saturday noon, all of the hostages better be released or, all hell's going to break loose. Well, that's not what I'm hearing from Israeli media and the reports coming from the Israeli cabinet. I think they're going to stick to this phased plan. And so my point there is you have a problem established when you make an ultimatum and then you don't keep it. And so I think that's a bit of a problem. The other thing that's wrong about the messaging, Trump talks about moving all the Palestinians out, and somebody initially talked about Indonesia, which I think if that were to happen, I don't think it will. East Asia would be destabilized because you've got a radicalized population. That's as big a problem as them being there physically. But saying we're going to move them out of there and then we're going to create a new Riviera in Gaza. Well, the next day, his own Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, said, wait a second, this is not a 3 to 5 year process. This is a 20-year process. It'll take 10 to 15 years to just clean the place up. Unexploded ordnance, booby trap passageways, tunnels. The place is not livable. And so from a practical standpoint, take political ideology out of it. From a practical standpoint, I think it's the only thing that can be done. Those people have to live somewhere. They can't live in Gaza for the next decade.
Okay. Brian, you're kind of on the ground there in Israel. What is going on there with the deal, the evacuation, continuing the ceasefire agreements?
Well, I can tell you that I have friends here who have been in the reserves, who've been recalled and are now on the border of Gaza, standing by in case they need to go back to war on Saturday if hostages are not released. And what's happened, I guess, in the last 24 hours or so is that Hamas has backed down from the threat of all hell breaking loose, saying, "Oh, we'll stick with it. We'll stick with the deal. We'll release hostages." On the one hand, Trump said, "Let them all out by Saturday," and now Hamas says, "Oh no, we're going to stick with the original deal. We'll let 3 out on Saturday." So the security cabinet here, Netanyahu and the security cabinet have met. We don't know everything they're saying, but it certainly appears they are ready to go back to war if they need to do so. In terms of the hostages and Hamas, this has been a tension from the beginning, because in Israel, getting the hostages out and getting rid of Hamas are two equally passionate objectives. And yet, how do you do both? Can you do both? It is, from a human perspective, it seems impossible. It seems to be either you do one or the other. And this has been the struggle that Netanyahu and his government have been dealing with. And Netanyahu, on his part, he's got a government that is made up of a lot of very right-wing coalition parties, and they have threatened to withdraw. In fact, one of them did withdraw. Itamar,
Ben-Gvir.
Ben-Gvir has withdrawn, and he was about to come back in if we went back to war, but he didn't take down the government. So all that to say is there's been a lot of political pressure that also reflects this tension in Israel between, yes, we need to defeat Hamas, because if we don't, if Hamas remains after this is all over, what has Israel gained? Have we not just gone back to October 6th? And I think that's a very valid argument. It will just happen again if Hamas remains. I have 2 points in response to what or two things to bring up. Itamar Marcus, who is the head of an organization called Palestinian Media Watch, published an article in the Jerusalem Post a couple of days ago, citing a poll that was taken by a very, very highly respected Palestinian polling group here. And the poll was taken before October 7, 2023. And it asked, if you could leave Gaza, would you? How many of you would leave and go someplace else? And the poll indicated that 44% before October 7 were ready to go. And you have to believe that after all that's happened over the last 16 months, that number's gone up. And so even among those who are voluntarily willing to go, even though we don't see this in the news, I suspect it's got to be well above what it was on October 6, 2023, which was 44%. If there are, 2.2 billion, however many people in Gaza right now, at least half or more are ready and willing to go someplace if they can get out of the hell that they're in. And it is a living hell for them right now. Hamas has reconstituted its numbers. And I'm sure all of you have seen the shows that they've put on with the release of hostages over the last few weeks, putting them up on platforms with screaming Hamas operatives and masked and shooting guns and yelling Allahu Akbar. All of it has been to present a reinvigorated, we're victorious, we've really won this because we've survived portrait to the West. Yes, they've actually recruited an equal, their numbers are back up to what they were before the war began. So in terms of the numbers of members of Hamas in Gaza right now, it's almost as if nothing's happened. And yet, they don't have the weapons. They don't have the rockets. They don't have the armaments that they had on October 6th. You might remember that Israel was getting hit with rockets from Hamas for months, every single day. And it's not going to happen. Yeah, that's the article. Great. And by the way, if you want to know what's going on in the Palestinian Authority and in the Palestinian area, go to Itamar Marcus's nonprofit, Palestinian Media Watch, PMW, whatever. You can just Google it. You'll find it.
Palwatch.org.
Yeah, he's fantastic. And he's making a big, big difference. He has had his finger on the pulse of what's going on in the Palestinian culture and government for decades now. Very, very, very credible person. So anyway, that's interesting. Israel also is very much aware that if they don't get rid of Hamas, more Israelis are going to die in the future. They know this. And there's also a sense of what's it all been worth? I mean, Israel's lost about 800 or so soldiers, IDF soldiers, somewhere in that range, who've been killed. Several thousand have been wounded since this began. Everybody here knows somebody who died or who has a family and knows a family of someone who died, either in their shul, their synagogue, or in their neighborhood. There's there's something here that the West, I don't think, can begin to comprehend, and that is, in Israel, there is a sense of community unlike anything I've ever seen any place in the world. Israelis know the names of these hostages. They know their stories. They regard them as family members. They weep when they come out. They experience the suffering, the sorrow, the grief when they die as if they were a family member. That's how visceral it is here. And yet at the same time, they're seeing blood being shed by members of their own family and community in this war that's gone on now for 16 months. So do we end it without winning? God forbid. One thing that I thought was very, very interesting was an analysis that Seth Franzman, who's a journalist, perhaps the most prolific journalist with the Jerusalem Post, he wrote a few days ago, analyzing what Trump was doing. And his theory was that Trump was shaking the grass. And he took this from an old China military strategy thing. You shake the grass, you beat the grass. You beat the grass to get the snakes out. And his theory was that Trump was doing it. He was beating the grass because when you beat the grass and the snakes come out, they're no longer hidden and you can deal with things. You have the ability to move. He's also along a similar metaphor. He's challenging the paradigm of this whole two-state solution thing that has been, cardinal political doctrine here for decades. And what's the definition of insanity? Trying to do the same thing over and over and over again, expecting a different result. And that's been exactly what's happened here, for several decades. And so what Trump is doing is he's saying, no, we've got to do something different. And we'll see how it all shakes out. But Israelis here have been actually open to what Trump has proposed. And in large numbers, you're seeing his political opponents saying, yeah, that's not a bad idea. And that's a big deal. when Netanyahu's political opponents are saying, yeah, that we should go there. I think there was a poll that indicated that something like 80% of all Israelis are kind of in line with what Trump has proposed. That's amazing. And that's because coming out of October 7 to the present, Israel we're not in post-trauma here. We are in trauma. This is happening. Today is still October 7 here. Today. And it has been a huge wake-up call. And Israelis are ready for a change, and they're not going to tolerate I'm trying not to use my initials here. They're not going to tolerate the baloney that the world's been kind of ramming down their throats for many, many decades now. And it's actually, I can just tell you from here, I got the news about what Trump said about Gaza. I woke up on last Wednesday morning, a week ago Wednesday, yesterday, and I had a text from a friend who said, you're waking up to some crazy news. And she said a headline, and I said, no way, I couldn't believe it. I mean, is this fake news? And I went and I looked, he had really said this, and it's like, wow. And at first it was, yeah, this is crazy. And yet on the other hand, as I have contemplated it being here, it's intriguing to me. The whole paradigm is being challenged, and I think, and a lot of Israelis think, that is a very, very good thing.
Yeah. So Jim, and then maybe Dexter. So in the subject that we were talking about, and the Trump proposal, how will it impact or not impact this problem that we have with anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and anti-Israel thought, even among Trump supporters? I mean, if I will just say this, I do watch Steve Bannon's War Room, and when he'll have on Carolyn Glick or a Jewish rabbi or something like that, the comments section becomes a Jew-hating sewer. And so I guess my question is, what's going to be the impact of what Trump's doing on anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism? And then maybe we can just finish up with what are some action items for us to take to help rectify the situation? So we'll start with Jim Fletcher first.
I think that the impulse to dissuade serious anti-Semites is not going to work. Our time is better spent on people that are willing to be educated, and I think that's where we should focus our efforts. I think as far as how it would impact, we're at a point now where, if you can come up with a viable solution that's practical and, as Trump says, common sense, just go ahead and do it, no matter the fallout. Because this whole plan that he wants to move the Palestinians out of Gaza, for the people that are Jew haters, this is just more protocols of the learned elders of Zion. It's just another Zionist plot. You're not going to dissuade them from that, so don't waste your breath or energy trying to do that. Focus on people that can be reached.
Okay. Hey, Dexter, what do you think?
Well, I think one of the other things that the Trump administration has done is gone after USAID funding of organizations that hate the United States and not just Israel. Okay. And essentially, Sam Westrup, one of my colleagues here at the Middle East Forum, has been doing heroic work for a long time, documenting how essentially, public funds have been going to Islamist institutions that are like working hand in glove with Hamas in Gaza. And also, we have actually been supporting Islamist institutions with public funds on a state, local, state, and federal level here in the United States for a long time as well. And you can go to the Middle East Forum's website to read about that. But I think that ultimately, the thing is that if we can demonstrate or remind people that the same people who hate Israel hate the United States for largely the same reasons, it's success, and ultimately because of our ability to essentially, be free, and we have equality, we have pluralism, we have constitutional rule of law, we have religious freedom, but you can't impose your beliefs on others or your practices on others. And once people start to recognize the threats to them, and that the threats that they face have basically been mirrors or echoes of threats being directed at the Jewish state since its founding, and once we realize that they're targets, they're in the crosshairs for this, I think ultimately we're going to win, because people are not, once they recognize that that Islamism makes, when it gets a foothold in a community or in a city, it makes life unsafe for the women in their lives. They're not going to like that. October 7th was a terrible act of violence against women. It was one of the worst acts of violence against Jews since the Holocaust, but it was also a terrible display of misogyny and hostility towards women. And the thing is that those things are supposed to be bad. Okay. And I think things are being disrupted enough that other leaders in the Middle East are starting to recognize that this Palestinianism is a threat to their rule. And so they're like, we're going to have to figure out a way to fix this problem. And I think in the long run, I'm a lot more hopeful than I was a few months ago. I really am. And once we start to solve the problems, people will have something else to think about other than how much they hate the Jews.
Okay. Hey, Brian, I had a question for you. Now I don't remember what it was. Where do you think this goes in the short term? Like the situation in Israel, let me phrase it with this. This is what I was going to ask you. They're releasing these terrorists into Judea and Samaria. What is the reaction on the ground to this? This just seems to be crazy. I interviewed Hillel Fold. I haven't posted the interview yet, Ari Fold's brother who was stabbed down at the Gush Etzion Junction, and the kid that did it just got released.
Right.
What is going on? I mean, to me, it just doesn't make any sense.
Well, there are things I think happening behind the scenes that we don't know about. And there are hints of what's going on in terms of what has happened in the Palestinian territories in Judea and Samaria over the past few weeks. 2 or 3 weeks ago, Israel got very, very serious about going after terror cells in the Palestinian territories, especially in the northern part of them in Jenin, where they were actually blowing up buildings and aggressively taking out terror cells and weapons production facilities inside Judea and Samaria in the Palestinian territory. So I suspect what's happening, by the way, these people that are being released, they're not going into Gaza. They're going into Judea and Samaria. They're going into the Palestinian territories there. So they're going right back into situations where they could murder Israelis as they did with Ari Fold. Now, I have to believe, I don't have any evidence, but I have to believe that Israel knows exactly where all these people are. I mean, a country with intelligence that would do all that it did with those beepers that it planted among Hezbollah many, many decades before, a country that knew exactly where Nasrallah was when it hit those bunkers. The intelligence here is amazing. And although hundreds have been released, I saw recently that as many as 80 have already been rearrested for crimes. And so Israel's keeping a very close eye on them. They named this thing, I don't know if I said it a minute ago, but they've named this operation in the West Bank, not the West, I like to call it the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria in the Palestinian territories. They named it Operation Iron Wall. So they're regarding this as really the next front that they were dealing with. Now, at the time, it looked like we had a longer ceasefire going on in Gaza. Whether or not that will continue, we will find out in a couple of days. I would like to kind of chime in though on what Dexter and Jim said. What can we do? What can we do here? And who, especially those of us who are not in Israel. I am, but most aren't. I think I keep coming back to what Jim said at the beginning of this, is that there is a tendency to love Israel and not like Jews, or not even knowing. And in my experience, a lot of Christians who support Israel love the idea of Israel, but they don't have any interaction with Jewish people. They don't know Jewish people. They don't hang out with them. They don't go. They've never been to a Shabbat meal. They've never been to a shul, a synagogue. They've never been in as you, John, and you and I were in a home, Yishai Fletcher, a few years ago, and sat down at their table and, heard the arguments and the back and forth and the kids talking about that week's Torah portion. And it was remarkable to sit and listen to this. These people are amazing, but we don't know them. And Christians need to get to know Jewish people. They need to get to know Israel, not just from what they hear on YouTube or from the pulpit. They need to come here. And when you come to Israel, please don't come just to see ancient sites. Those are worth seeing. They're nice to see. But a lot of the tours, if not most of them in the past, are tours that come with what I call bubbles. They bring their Western culture or whatever culture they're from, they bring that bubble with them, and that bubble's with it wherever the bus goes. And the only time they ever really encounter people here is when they get off the bus to buy souvenirs. And they're not really encountering people. So when you come to Israel, by all means, see the wonderful sights, but the real valuable, by far the most important, the most incredible, the most miraculous thing to see here is people. these people have survived. These are God's people, and get to know them.
Yeah. So, guys, there's a lot to talk about. We haven't even talked about Turkey and the radical Islamist mosque being built around the world. I will just point this as a teaser. I really want to do this with you guys again. I appreciate your time. Appreciate everybody listening. This was a poster published in Istanbul regarding a protest or demonstration, pro-Palestinian demonstration in Istanbul on January the 1st, led by the son of Erdogan. It has very significant symbolism there. The title of the march was "A Sun is Rising," and you see the sun there with the Turkish and Palestinian flags. And then the stuff across the top says, "First Hagia Sophia, the largest church ever built in Christendom that Erdogan turned into a mosque back in a few years ago, calling it the resurrection of Hagia Sophia." In the middle is today Umayyad, which is Damascus, the most important Shia mosque during the Umayyad Empire of the 8th century, 7th and 8th century. And then on the right, tomorrow, Al-Aqsa, Israel and the Jews. And so I think this is where this is heading. This is a battle of the ages. And hopefully we can talk about this in the future. And by the way, this is a soft announcement. I'm going to probably be leading a tour to Israel in around Sukkot in the fall. Look for announcements about that in the next week. And but we want to do some different things. We want to do some, like Brian said, get with the people. We would probably visit to the Gaza border area, the kibbutzim down there, and possibly in the north as well. So I just think that it is important. And Brian, I will second what you said about Shabbat at the Fleischers. It truly was one of the most impactful evenings of my life. It sort of touched me on many levels. So again, Dexter, Jim, Brian, I really, really appreciate you taking the time. Everybody, if you can like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell on our YouTube channel, that would be great. And guys, I'm going to stop the live stream and I'll say goodbye to you on the other side. So again, everybody, thanks for watching this morning.
Thanks so much.